It was 5 in the morning when I heard the unmistakable clink of silverware from inside my locked boathouse. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then came the sound of a cupboard slamming shut, followed by a woman's voice humming along to soft jazz. I hadn't stepped inside that boathouse in nearly a month, and it was sealed tighter than a vault. My stomach dropped. Still in my flannel pajama pants and boots without socks, I grabbed my flashlight and trudged down the rocky path toward the dock, expecting to find a raccoon or maybe some squatter who'd broken in through the side. What I did not expect was HOA Karen, wearing a floral robe, sipping coffee on the deck of my boathouse like she owned the place. There was a pink inflatable flamingo tied to the cleat post, a Bluetooth speaker playing Kenny G, and the unmistakable smell of lavender candles wafting out the door. When she saw me, she waved like I was the uninvited guest. I stood there stunned, flashlight still pointing straight at her, until I finally managed to ask what in the world she was doing. Her response? Oh, I thought it was abandoned. Abandoned. The boathouse had motion sensor lights, solar panels I installed last year, and a full security lock on the entrance. Not to mention, it was 200 feet from my home on private lakefront property with a clearly marked no trespassing sign. But Karen? She just chuckled and took another sip of her coffee. Said something about how peaceful the water was and how she simply needed a mental health weekend. Without asking. Without permission. Without even a knock on my door. Before I could react, she invited me to join her for breakfast, like she was hosting some lakeside Airbnb retreat. The worst part was, she genuinely believed she was doing nothing wrong. She motioned to the inside, which she had redecorated with throw pillows and a fake succulent arrangement on the window ledge. My kayak was leaned against the far wall, untouched, but everything else, my fold-out chairs, cooler, fishing poles, had been rearranged to suit her lakeside aesthetic. I tried to keep calm and explain that she was on private property, inside a locked structure, and she needed to leave immediately. But Karen didn't flinch. Instead, she pulled out a laminated HOA pamphlet and started pointing to some nonsense clause about shared waterfront amenities that supposedly gave her temporary access to all neighborhood structures not in current use. I laughed at first, thinking she had to be joking. But her face was dead serious. According to her twisted interpretation, my boathouse, which I hadn't used in 3 weeks, counted as an inactive shared structure. Never mind that it wasn't even part of the HOA boundaries. I don't live inside their jurisdiction. I live adjacent to it, with my own private parcel of land grandfathered in from the original development. But Karen and her crew had always acted like the lake belonged to them. They treated the shore like a public beach, even though the deed said otherwise. Now this was a new level of delusion. I told her to leave again. This time firmly. She stood, adjusted her robe like a queen, and told me I was disturbing the serenity of the environment. When I stepped onto the deck to open the door myself, I found it locked. She had somehow replaced the inside latch. I knocked. She just smiled through the glass and said she didn't feel safe letting me in unless I calmed down. Me, the property owner. I marched back up the path fuming and called the sheriff's office, hoping they'd come put an end to this madness. But when the deputy arrived, Karen met him at the boathouse with hot tea and a full printed folder of what she called her occupancy rights. The deputy, clearly trying not to laugh, told me this looked like a civil issue unless I had immediate proof of forced entry or damage. I showed him the photos from a month ago when I locked the place up and left it. He shrugged and said a judge would need to sort it out. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Karen smiled the whole time like she'd just won a game of Monopoly. When the deputy left, she waved me off with a smug little salute and told me to consider the weekend a rental experiment. I told her again to vacate or I'd file charges. She said, "Please do," then muttered something about how she had already ordered an outdoor rug and some solar string lights. The woman was planning to stay. So I filed a formal complaint with the HOA board. Turns out she'd already been talking to them, claimed the boathouse was community adjacent, and since I hadn't been using it actively, she had simply revitalized a neglected asset. The HOA president, who I'd clashed with before over similar nonsense, actually backed her up, said something about how my refusal to integrate my property into the HOA spirit was alienating the neighborhood. I nearly choked. I'm not even part of their HOA. I bought my land before they existed. But that didn't stop them from trying to creep their rules outward like a virus. Karen stayed the entire weekend. She hosted a brunch for her friends on Sunday morning, complete with mimosas, yoga mats, and a Bluetooth karaoke session that echoed across the lake. I recorded everything. I took photos. I made sure to capture the stack of delivery boxes with her name on them arriving right on my dock. She had turned my boathouse into a retreat center in less than 72 hours. When I tried once more to reason with her Sunday evening, she threatened to file a restraining order against me. Said I was harassing a vulnerable woman during her time of healing. I nearly laughed myself into a coma. That night, I sat at my kitchen table looking over every piece of paperwork I had, title deeds, plat maps, utility bills, everything proving the boathouse was on private property. Then I stumbled onto something interesting. A section of lake property law involving moored structures. The moment a structure is detached from land and floating without anchor to private property, it becomes a vessel, not a residence. Meaning, it's governed under entirely different rules. That sparked an idea. A wonderfully legal, hilariously poetic idea. If Karen wanted to live in the boathouse, maybe I'd just let her. But not where she expected. Because if it wasn't moored to land anymore, she had no legal ground to stand on. Literally. And I had just the tool to make that happen. There was a tugboat listed online for cheap, only one county over. Slightly rusty, sure, but with enough horsepower to tow a floating boathouse straight into the middle of the lake. Karen thought she'd won. Thought I'd give up or back down like the HOA always expected. But this time, I wasn't just planning to fight back. I was going to change the playing field. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't confrontation. Sometimes, it's drifting someone far enough away that even their own delusions can't float them back to shore. By Monday morning, the boathouse no longer looked like a place for weekend fishing trip. It looked like a floating Pinterest board curated by a suburban tyrant. Karen had somehow hauled in curtains, a throw blanket set, a rack of robes, and even a ceramic welcome sign shaped like a seashell. My own chairs had been replaced with beachy loungers, and she'd placed little hand-painted rocks with cheesy quotes like "Serenity starts here" along the dock rail. I stood there, blinking in disbelief, while she offered me a fruit smoothie like this was a sandals resort. Worse, she had a clipboard now. A clipboard. With an itinerary taped to it that listed everything from sun salutations at sunrise to sound bath healing at noon. And somehow, in the twisted HOA dimension she seemed to live in, this wasn't trespassing, it was a lakeside revitalization project. That same morning, I spotted her giving a guided tour of the boathouse to a group of 3 women from the neighborhood. She stood at the doorway in her yoga pants and oversized sunglasses, gesturing dramatically to each section like she was listing it on Airbnb. I snapped pictures from my kitchen window, zoomed in on her pointing at my tackle box and calling it nautical decor, and I knew I had to escalate things. But I also knew I needed to be smart. The sheriff's deputy last time had practically rolled his eyes at the whole mess. So I had to build a case airtight enough that even Karen's HOA cronies couldn't weasel out of it. I started by pulling footage from the hidden cameras I had installed inside the boathouse over a year ago. Originally meant to deter raccoons and the occasional drunk teen thinking it was a party shack, the cameras had silently recorded every second of Karen's conquest. From the moment she first pried open the back window to the smug yoga classes on the deck, everything was saved. She had no clue I had a clear recording of her saying, "If he complains, I'll just say I thought it was abandoned," while laughing with one of her friends. I compiled it all into a neat file and backed it up 3 times. Next, I began digging into the HOA's bylaws, even though I wasn't under their jurisdiction. And what I found made me laugh harder than I had in weeks. Their shared waterfront amenity clause applied only to common-use docks and gazebos within HOA-managed land, not to adjacent properties or private boathouses, which the HOA had no legal access to. In short, Karen's whole defense was built on something that had absolutely no standing. But knowing Karen, she wouldn't care. She was using the HOA's name more like a shield than a rulebook. I needed to cut through that shield and hit where it mattered: public image. That opportunity came sooner than expected. Karen posted a video online, yes, actually uploaded it herself, bragging about her wellness retreat and inviting her followers to attend her Saturday evening lakeside silent disco. I watched it 3 times, jaw hanging open. She panned the camera across the boathouse interior, showing off her decorations, the fridge stocked with kombucha, and even gave a shout-out to the neighborhood association for letting me use this space. She had no clue she was confessing to trespassing in a now-public video. I downloaded the clip, watermarked it, and sent it to a friend who ran a local neighborhood Facebook group. Within 2 hours, the video was posted with the caption, "This our HOA president thinks this is okay?" The comments section exploded. Most people didn't even know I wasn't in the HOA. All they saw was Karen hijacking someone else's property, bragging about it, and dragging the HOA's name into it. Some neighbors were furious. A few were even embarrassed, messaging me privately to say they had no idea she'd gone that far. One man named Greg, who had lived on the street for 20 years, said he'd file a formal complaint himself. The tide was starting to shift. Karen, of course, doubled down. She posted a follow-up video where she claimed she was being digitally harassed by aggressive men, and that she was reclaiming neglected space for the emotional benefit of the community. I kept building my plan. The Craigslist tugboat was still available, and I drove out to inspect it with my buddy Nate, who worked in marine maintenance. It needed a little oil and a fresh battery, but otherwise it was lake-ready. I paid cash. Nate helped me install a hitch, and by Thursday afternoon, we had it docked at the far end of my shoreline, hidden behind some trees where Karen couldn't see it from the boathouse. The plan was simple: unmoor the boathouse, drag it slowly into the center of the lake, and let it float peacefully without a single tie to land. Legally, once unanchored and detached, it stopped being on property and became a movable watercraft. Karen would no longer be squatting on land. She'd be drifting. But I didn't want to pull the trigger just yet. I wanted one last nail in the legal coffin. So I called my cousin Amy, a junior lawyer who had just finished a case involving property line dispute. I told her the whole story. She laughed hard, but promised to draft a letter warning Karen that she was facing trespassing, misrepresentation, and unlawful entry charges if she didn't vacate voluntarily within 48 hours. Amy even included a section citing maritime structure law, explaining what would happen if the boathouse became detached. I printed 3 copies and left one taped to the boathouse door, one slid under her beach chair, and one mailed to the HOA office. No one could say they weren't warned. Karen's response was as unhinged as ever. She returned the letter with a note that said, "Nice try. This is a community zone now. Get used to it." The next morning, she added a sign to the boathouse dock that read, "Lake Wellness Sanctuary, members only." She had crossed over from delusional to cult leader. But that was fine. She was exactly where I needed her to be. Friday evening came, and I went over my checklist with Nate one last time. Tugboat ready. Towline prep. Weather forecast calm. Karen? Still lounging with her friends, clinking wine glasses and playing ambient spa music. She had no idea that by sunrise, her stolen retreat would no longer have an address. It would just be floating, untethered, unclaimed, and legally hers in name only. As night fell, I watched from my porch with binoculars. The boathouse lights flickered as Karen hosted a full moon meditation circle. The sheer absurdity of it all had reached poetic levels. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about someone so entitled, so emboldened by a taste of power, that she genuinely believed the lake bowed to her presence. She had taken something that wasn't hers, wrapped it in incense and ego, and convinced herself it was a gift to the neighborhood. I smiled as I checked the fuel on the tugboat. The plan was set. I wasn't going to argue anymore. I wasn't going to post rebuttals online or go back to court. I was going to do what lake people have always done when something gets in their way. Move it. Slowly. Legally. Publicly. And the best part? I'd be doing it with Karen still inside, still sipping her tea, completely unaware that the lake was about to become her new front yard, and backyard, and everything in between. The lake was still dark when I pulled the tarp off the tugboat. Mist curled over the water like smoke from a quiet fire, and every sound echoed louder than usual. I had checked the tow lines 3 times, adjusted the cleats, and double-checked the steering. Nate was already waiting at the boathouse end of the dock, giving me a silent thumbs-up from behind the brush. We both wore dark clothes, not because we were doing anything illegal, but because the sheer drama of the moment demanded stealth. The tugboat sputtered to life with a low rumble, loud enough that I winced, but not so loud that it echoed across the lake. Karen, presumably still fast asleep after her late-night full-moon ritual, didn't stir. The rope we had pre-secured to the boathouse days ago was hidden beneath the rear deck slats, looped and ready. Nate tossed it to me and I locked it onto the tow bar. The boathouse, despite its fancified decor, floated with surprising ease. It rocked slightly as the slack pulled tight, but otherwise remained still. Slowly, ever so slowly, I throttled forward. The structure groaned faintly, adjusting to the pull, but within 30 seconds we were moving. The plan was to take it to the deepest center of the lake, right past the legal halfway point, and drop a temporary anchor just deep enough that it wouldn't drift back to shore. It wasn't permanent mooring, just a casual float in legal limbo, enough to make Karen wake up and question reality. By the time we reached the halfway mark, pink hues were breaking across the horizon. The mist had begun to lift, revealing the boathouse now sitting gracefully in open water, completely detached from my shoreline. I cut the engine and let it coast for a moment, just to watch it bob gently in place. Nate was trying hard not to laugh, crouched behind the shrubs on my dock with binoculars trained on the scene. Then the lights inside the boathouse flicked on. A silhouette moved past the windows. The moment had arrived. Karen appeared in the doorway, yawning and stretching, wearing one of her gaudy silk robes and holding a steaming cup of tea. It took her a full 10 seconds to realize that something was off. She looked left, then right, then stepped out onto the small porch, blinked at the open lake, and nearly dropped her mug. She turned in a circle, eyes scanning the waterline, and then cupped her hands over her mouth and shouted a confused, echoing hello. Nate collapsed onto his back in laughter. I leaned on the railing of the tugboat, watching her slowly spin as realization crept into her bones like cold water. I could hear her yelling now, though the words were mostly wind-blown fragments. Something about calling the police, something else about kidnapping a structure, and then the phrase, "This is a federal offense," which made me chuckle. She stormed back inside, likely looking for her phone. Within minutes, she was back outside, pacing, phone in hand, gesturing wildly as she tried to explain to whoever answered 911 that her lakeside property had been relocated to international waters. I couldn't hear the dispatcher's response, but judging by her expression, it wasn't what she hoped for. A few moments later, her voice got louder, this time directed at the shore. "Bring me back!" she screamed, pointing furiously toward the neighborhood. "This is false imprisonment. You can't just abandon someone at sea." I stepped back, letting the trees cover me from view. Nate was rolling, tears in his eyes, trying to stay quiet. Karen began waving her arms toward a neighbor across the water who was out for a jog. The neighbor paused, blinked, then simply waved back awkwardly before continuing her run. Karen yelled again, but her voice was losing power. Her authority, so potent on land, didn't carry the same weight on open water. About 20 minutes passed before she gave up yelling. She retreated inside the boathouse, probably to call reinforcements. We didn't have to wait long. Soon, a familiar buzzing broke the morning air, the sound of a jet ski engine. I recognized the HOA treasurer, Brad, immediately. He was wearing one of those absurd life vests that looked more decorative than functional, and behind him trailed a rope. Karen rushed to the edge of the deck, hollering like a shipwrecked aristocrat. Brad pulled up, threw her the rope, and shouted, "Tie it to the porch. I'll tow you back." That was the part one had been waiting for. She looped the rope hastily, yelling orders like she was some marooned admiral. Brad hit the gas, the rope tightened, and the front of the boathouse shuddered. The porch groaned, and one of the decorative flower boxes Karen had installed snapped off and floated away like a tiny raft. Brad tried to muscle the boathouse toward shore, but it barely budged. The floating structure wasn't exactly aerodynamic, and Brad's jet ski was more suited for teenage lake races than towing a house. Then came the snap. The rope, straining against too much resistance, broke mid-pull and slingshot backward, flinging Brad off his jet ski. He landed in the water with a yelp and flail, while the jet ski idled in a wide circle nearby. Karen screamed his name and leaned over the rail, but there was nothing she could do. He swam back drenched, climbed aboard the boathouse, and sat beside her, gasping and muttering about nautical sabotage. Nate had to put a towel in his mouth to keep from laughing loud enough to echo. Karen tried calling 911 again. This time, she insisted she was being held hostage, that I had removed her land access and marooned her in the middle of the lake. But the dispatcher, likely the same one from before, responded with something that clearly didn't satisfy her. She hung up, fuming, and started live streaming. Her voice echoed across the lake as she narrated her harrowing ordeal, complete with weepy background music. "My name is Karen McDougal," she said, "and I have been illegally evicted and cast adrift by a bitter neighbor with no heart and no understanding of spiritual healing. This is an act of violence against peace." I watched her video later that day. It was gold. Her face covered in overdone foundation, her robe stained with lake water, Brad pacing behind her and muttering about rope strength and maritime rescue. Viewers began piling in with sarcastic comments. One user asked if she'd seen Wilson from the movie Cast Away. Another offered to send a paddle. Someone made a meme of her face photoshopped onto a lighthouse with the caption, "Queen of Denial." The clip went viral before sunset. Later that afternoon, the sheriff's lake patrol finally showed up. 2 officers arrived on a small pontoon boat, pulled up next to the boathouse, and had a brief, animated conversation with Karen. I couldn't hear it all, but judging by the body language, it was clear they weren't amused. She tried pointing toward my dock, waving her arms in exasperation, but they calmly showed her a printout and then motioned toward the shore. Within minutes, they handed her a formal trespass notice. I'd filed it earlier that week and had it approved that morning. Now that she was no longer on my property and her residency had become a floating joke, the law had all the clarity it needed. Karen didn't take it well. She started yelling at the officers, demanding to know how this was legal, why no one cared about her rights, and how I could get away with stealing the earth under her feet. One of the officers replied, "Ma'am, you're not on the earth anymore. You're on a boat." That line alone was worth every bit of stress this woman had caused. Eventually, they escorted her back to shore with Brad in tow. The boathouse remained right where I left it, floating peacefully, unmanned, and stripped of entitlement. As night fell, I sat on my porch, sipping a beer, watching the silhouette of my boathouse gently rocking under the stars. The air was quiet, peaceful, and finally free of lavender candles and spa music. Karen had tried to own my space, my time, and my patience. Now all she owned was a memory, and a spot on every HOA meme page from here to Florida. The lake was mine again, and it had never looked better. By the next morning, the entire neighborhood knew what had happened. Not just the people on my street or the ones with a clear view of the lake, everyone. The story spread like wildfire, carried through group chats, Facebook pages, and by the second afternoon, it had even hit Reddit. Someone posted the clip of Karen ranting on the floating boathouse, calling it Castaway Karen, the HOA queen who floated too far. Comments flooded in. Most were pure gold. People asked if she'd started a floating nation, if she needed rescue flares, or if she'd begun speaking dolphin. A few even photoshopped pirate hats onto her head and gave her a flag that read, "Entitlement Ahoy." The story had transcended local drama and become a full-blown internet moment. Karen, on the other hand, was imploding. By the following day, she had gone from floating self-proclaimed wellness guru to full-on HOA martyr. She released a carefully edited video trying to spin the situation in her favor. In it, she sat on a white couch with potted plants in the background, speaking in a soft voice about being emotionally ambushed and spiritually vandalized. She claimed that I had deliberately targeted her wellness retreat because I had repressed anger toward female empowerment and was threatened by her success as a community leader. The comments section didn't buy it for a second. Most pointed out how she had squatted on private property, redecorated it, hosted parties, then called the police on the actual owner. Others began digging into her HOA record and unearthed years' worth of complaints, citations she had issued for mailbox paint being too loud, and her attempt last year to ban wind chimes because they were too chaotic. But Karen wasn't done yet. When her PR video failed to win public sympathy, she switched strategies. The HOA filed an official cease and desist letter against me, claiming that my actions had caused disruption, endangered a resident, and undermined the harmony of the lakeside community. They demanded that I return the boathouse to its original dock location and apologize to Karen in writing. It was the kind of letter you'd expect from a kindergarten principal scolding a 5-year-old for pulling a prank. I didn't respond directly. Instead, I forwarded the letter to my lawyer cousin Amy, who laughed so hard she choked on her coffee. She drafted a response that was so elegantly brutal it should have been framed. She cited lake laws, trespass regulations, HOA boundary limits, and court precedents, then ended with a single line. Please advise your client, Ms. Karen McDougall, that she is not above the law, nor does she possess riparian dominion over private property. In other words, no. But the HOA wasn't backing down easily. Their next move was even more ridiculous. They tried to hold an emergency board meeting where the main agenda was to vote on annexing the section of lakefront where my property sat. Their idea was that if they rezoned the edge of the water as part of the shared recreation district, then technically my dock and boathouse would fall under HOA regulation. It was so far beyond legal logic, it would have been hilarious if it weren't so infuriating. They mailed flyers around the neighborhood urging residents to attend and support the protection of shared lakefront resources from hostile behavior. Karen, of course, was leading the charge. The meeting took place at the community clubhouse that Saturday, and I decided to attend. Not to argue, but to observe and record. I walked in wearing a shirt that read, "Property owner, not pirate," and nodded politely to the folks who gave me sheepish glances. The place was packed, mostly because people had heard about the floating boathouse saga and wanted to see what insane thing would happen next. Karen stood at the front like she was hosting a TED Talk, complete with a clicker in her hand and a slideshow behind her titled, "Preserving Community Access: The Lakefront Crisis." She actually had graphs, none of which made any sense. One chart showed a decline in communal serenity, another one measured emotional blockade levels. It was performance art at this point. When the floor opened for public comment, Greg, the older neighbor who'd lived there longest, stood up. He cleared his throat and said, "Look, I've been here longer than this HOA has existed. That man," he pointed at me, "owns his property fair and square. Always has. And Karen? You broke into a boathouse and turned it into a day spa. You're lucky he didn't press criminal charges." A few people clapped. Karen tried to shout over him, accusing Greg of being emotionally manipulated, but the room wasn't on her side anymore. Another neighbor chimed in and asked, "If it was a wellness center, why did you call the police when he came to his own dock?" That got more claps. By the end of the meeting, the board tabled the vote. The president looked visibly embarrassed, muttering something about needing to review legal boundaries more thoroughly. Karen stormed out without saying another word. That night, someone updated the Reddit post with a screenshot from the meeting and titled it, "HOA Meeting Ends in Karen's Mutiny." It got thousands of upvotes. Commenters declared it the greatest HOA saga they'd ever followed. I didn't post anything. I didn't need to. The story was carrying itself now. A few days later, I got a letter in the mail. This time not from the HOA, but from a lawyer representing Karen directly. She was threatening to sue for emotional distress, defamation, and personal injury related to forced flotation. Amy read it aloud in her best courtroom voice and then immediately began compiling a countersuit. We had hours of footage, drone shots of the boathouse being towed peacefully, footage of Karen hosting parties on my property, and her own live streams where she openly admitted she didn't have permission but felt the space was abandoned. Amy's letter back was short, "See you in court." Meanwhile, Karen's reputation had hit rock bottom. People avoided her at the grocery store. Someone tagged her car with a sticky note that read, "Lake Queen in exile." Her Instagram followers dropped like flies, and she eventually made her profile private. Her own HOA board began distancing themselves. They issued a statement saying that the boathouse situation was not representative of the values or decision-making of the community leadership. It was a fancy way of saying, "She acted alone and we're done." Then came the best part. At the next HOA election, several new candidates ran on the platform of restoring sanity and ending overreach. Karen lost her board seat. The president stepped down. A younger woman named Felicia took over, someone who'd publicly defended me during the boathouse ordeal. One of her first moves was to amend the bylaws to prevent any HOA official from entering or using non-member property under any circumstances. She called it the Karen Clause. I almost framed the notice. The lake was finally quiet again. The boathouse still floated where I left it, perfectly legal and undisturbed. Every morning, I'd wake up, drink coffee on the deck, and watch the sun rise over the water, knowing that peace had returned not just to the shoreline, but to the entire neighborhood. And Karen? She vanished for a while. I heard whispers she was looking to move. No surprise there. After all, it's hard to keep ruling a lake you got banished from. But I wasn't finished just yet. Something was coming. Something poetic. Something fitting for a woman who tried to turn my property into her kingdom. Because while the world had laughed at her story, I had one last chapter to write. And it was going to float right into viral legend. A month after the saga that turned my peaceful lake into a national comedy stage, I sat on my deck with a glass of sweet tea and a file in my hand marked, "Auction Plan, Final Draft." The lake was quiet now, the weather crisp and wind soft against the surface. No more candle-scented fog drifting from the boathouse. No more spontaneous yoga chants echoing across the water. Karen had disappeared from view and, from what little I'd heard, was laying low after losing her HOA position and failing to intimidate anyone through her laughable lawsuit. Her own lawyer reportedly dropped her after the defamation threats backfired and her public videos were used against her. It was the silence after a ridiculous storm, and I was ready to bring closure in my own way, with style. I had spent the last 2 weeks coordinating something unique, something poetic, something that would turn the final chapter of this bizarre story into a piece of performance art. I had legally transferred ownership of the boathouse to a shell company I'd created for one single purpose: to auction it off as a one-of-a-kind floating structure, complete with its own story, news coverage, and meme legacy. But this wasn't just about selling a floating shack. This was about closing a loop, taking something that had been the symbol of unwanted intrusion and flipping it into a symbol of rightful, hilarious revenge. The online auction went live on a Thursday evening with the title Karen's Island, a fully furnished floating boathouse of entitlement and infamy. I included a video walkthrough of the boathouse with voiceover commentary, highlighting key features like the meditation mat where HOA policy was first overruled by lake law, the deck from which false 911 calls were placed, and the tea-stained railing where she demanded to be rescued from her own crime. I posted a few of Karen's now private social media clips, public domain by then thanks to news coverage, and added a special section called Floating Amenities, listing things like 0 neighbors, no HOA interference, and the only retreat center in North America to be forcibly relocated mid-Mimosa. Bidding exploded within hours. Not because it was a luxury property, it wasn't, but because it was famous. Reddit had latched on again. Influencers started sharing the listing for laugh. A travel blogger posted that she would use it as an off-grid journaling hideaway. One YouTuber offered to buy it just to film a parody series called Karen's Lake Diaries. Even a company that specialized in viral marketing tried to bid on it as a floating billboard. The comments were a circus. Will it come with free sage sticks? Can I dock it next to my moral compass? Does the ghost of entitlement linger, or was she exorcised during the silent disco? By day 3, the boathouse had been bid up to $15,000, far more than its actual material value. The winning bid came from a tech entrepreneur who'd made his fortune in online gaming. He messaged me directly to say, "This is the most absurd, brilliant thing I've ever seen. I'm buying it as a conversation piece. Also, my girlfriend's name is Karen, and she's going to die laughing." We finalized the paperwork, and I arranged for the boathouse to be towed to the buyer's private lake the following weekend. But before it left, I added one final touch. On the inside of the main door, I hung a gold-framed plaque that read, "Here floated the Queen of HOA Entitlement. May all who enter leave their egos at the shore." As the tugboat pulled the boathouse away for the last time, a few neighbors gathered to watch. Greg brought lawn chairs and popcorn. Someone blasted the Titanic theme from a Bluetooth speaker. It was surreal and ridiculous and perfect. I saluted the structure one last time as it vanished beyond the bend. A part of me almost missed it, not for what it was but for the chaos it represented. The absurdity of one person's unshakable belief that rules didn't apply to them. But the best part was knowing that story didn't end in frustration. It ended with justice, laughter, and a massive internet mic drop. Karen, meanwhile, did not take the news well. Apparently, she hadn't been told I was auctioning off the boathouse, and when she found out, via a viral TikTok video with over 4 million views, she tried to claim I had profited off her trauma. She posted a bitter rant accusing me of exploiting her and mocking wellness culture, but the public was already done with her narrative. Her comment section turned on her instantly. People reminded her she trespassed, lied to law enforcement, and tried to weaponize the HOA like it was her personal army. She deleted the post within hours. Days later, she put her house up for sale. I watched her moving truck pull away 2 weeks later. No farewell, no apologies, no acknowledgement. Just silence. I couldn't help but smile. It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. No screaming match, no courtroom brawl. Just a slow, strategic, humiliating unraveling, one that she orchestrated herself, one step at a time. That's the thing about people like Karen. They build their own disasters. You just have to stand back far enough to let them collapse under the weight of their own entitlement. The HOA, now under new leadership, officially amended their charter with a clear set of boundaries and legal education requirements for board members. They hosted a town barbecue where the new president joked about installing Karen detectors at the lake entrance. People laughed, toasted, and most importantly, relaxed for the first time in months. My dock was finally peaceful again. My mornings no longer involved lavender-scented trespassers. The lake was mine, quiet and still, and the only voices I heard were birds and the occasional boat motor echoing from across the water. I ended up turning part of the shoreline into a small open seating area with benches and fire pits for neighbors to use, open to everyone, HOA or not, with just one rule posted on a wooden sign: no Karens beyond this point. People loved it. It became a neutral zone, a place where feuds could cool off and beer could replace bickering. It was funny how one floating structure and a few weeks of ridiculous drama had actually brought people together. Sometimes, justice doesn't come with sirens and judges and official charges. Sometimes it comes with a tugboat, a viral video, and the sound of a house quietly drifting into the middle of a lake. Karen wanted to rule something. Instead, she became a cautionary tale. And while she's probably telling some new neighborhood right now that she was the victim of a coordinated campaign of lakefront bullying, the rest of us know the truth. She wasn't exiled. She wasn't targeted. She was simply told no, and she couldn't stand it. And in the end, that's the real story. Not just about a boathouse or an HOA. It's about boundaries. The ones we draw physically, legally, and sometimes hilariously, with tugboats and TikTok. Because when someone moves into your space uninvited, takes over your property, and tries to spin a fantasy into a right, the best response isn't always to fight fire with fire. Sometimes the best revenge is a slow float into poetic justice, and letting the whole world watch it drift.